Hi, I'm Dr. Jewel Miller. I'm a board-certified general psychiatrist. I'm also board-certified in child and adolescent psychiatry. So I treat a lot of people who have ADHD. As some of you may know, there's been a shortage in stimulant medication, the primary medicine used to treat ADHD, for most of this year and actually some of the other. It continues to go on, and numerous explanations have been given, but there's really only one explanation, and that's government quotas. That's what has made it impossible for some people to get ADHD medication, even when the child, for instance, is failing in school, or for adults who find it hard to do their basic work and to earn a living for the same reason. Now, the government, of course, has different explanations, and I'm going to show you a letter the FDA and DEA jointly put out about a month ago, the beginning of August, trying to basically lay blame on everybody else and refusing to accept responsibility, and then coming up with a number of solutions that are utterly unrealistic. And in this context, I also want to talk about government regulation in general of the economy and particularly of medicine, and most particularly of the opioid production, because that's also caused a lot of people to have to end up in pain that wouldn't otherwise. And furthermore, the regulations the government has come up with, and not just the federal government, but the state governments as well, has caused more people to overdose and die from opioids than would have occurred if they just left things alone. And that may seem counterproductive in some ways, because we all know, or we've all heard how people were dying because of the pills their doctors were giving them. And that has been greatly restricted, so much so that, again, a lot of people are left in pain. Just like with the stimulant shortage, a lot of people are left with ADHD and not able to function well. But in both these cases, it's the government that's caused a worsening of the problem by trying to implement regulations and impose government controls on the free market. We've seen throughout history, and especially in the 20th century, how poor central government guesses of people's needs for goods and services really is. In the Soviet Union, for instance, when I was studying Russian in high school, there were lines and lines going around the blocks, just people waiting for toilet paper and just basic life necessities. They'd have to be in huge lines because the government can't really predict who's going to need things the most, when they're going to need it the most, and how to handle that. Only a free market system has the capacity to react quickly enough to fill needs when needs arise, and to adequately distribute scarce resources to where they're needed the most. A large economy like ours involves millions and millions of decisions occurring every day, and the government can't keep up with that. Even the largest supercomputer on this planet couldn't keep up with that. The free market, though, is built from the bottom up by a number of individuals who express their needs and wishes, and by suppliers who will supply them, and by the costs and benefits that tend to balance out everything. So then when something becomes scarce and prices rise, people see that, hey, I can make money by making more of that, and they start doing it. And then the scarcity disappears. And when things aren't needed as much, the company stops making those things, or the company goes out of business. Either way, it quickly returns to a balance, much quicker in any case than the government could possibly do or could possibly imagine. And so, what we're dealing with a stimulant crisis is the government feeling that, well, the government knows better what's good for you or bad for you, and that if it allowed the drug companies to make as much Adderall or Ritalin or any of the other stimulants as they wanted, the people would all get hooked on Adderall and become speed freaks, and it would destroy society. Essentially, that's the basic rationale. So the government has to protect you from yourself and set up quotas. So the companies can't react when people need more medication, such as what happened with the COVID crisis and with people going home, where previously people with borderline cases of ADHD who could function reasonably well in their regular jobs were now home under unusual situations, under stress, and their borderline ADHD became full-blown ADHD. So the And the government tries to blame the company. So I want to read through this letter the FDA and DEA jointly put out to Dear Americans on August 1st, 2023, and demonstrate how much it is an attempt to really get out of any blame and to misdirect and blame other people for the problem. So at the beginning, it says, the first paragraph basically is admitting that there's a problem and that the lack of availability of certain medications in recent months has been understandably frustrating for patients and their families. The second paragraph, however, they right away begin diffusing responsibility. Instead of simply addressing the fact that they have these quotas and that they haven't adjusted these quotas to meet demand, they say that they want to update us on the ongoing actions they're taking to resolve the shortages, which do not include increasing quotas. At least they don't say anything about it in this letter. They say this is not a problem that the FDA and DEA can solve on our own. We are urging all stakeholders to work together to resolve these shortages as quickly as possible. Again, they're just diffusing responsibility and starting to deny their responsibility. In the third paragraph, they out and out say it's not our problem. They say the FDA and DEA do not manufacture drugs and cannot require a pharmaceutical company to make a drug, make more of a drug, or change the distribution of a drug. In other words, it's not our problem. Yes, it's their problem. In the next paragraph, they say, the current shortage of stimulant medications is a result of many factors. It began last fall due to a manufacturing delay experienced by one drug maker. So here they begin the blame game by specifically pointing the finger at the drug companies. But that's not the end of it. They remark that from 2012 to 2021, overall dispensing of stimulants increased by 45.5% in the United States. So right away they're trying to blame the doctors, saying, we're prescribing too much medication, instead of looking at the facts, which from 2012 to 2021, not only has the population increased, but the amount of stress in society has increased. And particularly with COVID, which was raging in 2021. And that is any kind of stress makes any illness worse. And that's particularly evident in ADHD. So here they go now blaming the doctors. And then they go on to say, in certain groups, the percentage of increase in stimulants during the public health emergency, during COVID-19, grew by more than 10%. Oh my gosh, I'm going to fall out of my chair. Can you imagine it? People are at home and can't function normally, and they actually had to take more Ritalin in order to stay on task and try to keep up with their job or with their schoolwork. I can't believe that, can you? Well, that's what they're kind of implying, that something fishy is going along. And at the end of that paragraph, they say, it's also an appropriate time to take a closer look at how we can best ensure these drugs are being prescribed thoughtfully and responsibly. In other words, coming back to blaming the doctors and blaming the patients, and hinting that things are being, the people are abusing these medications and they're not being used for what they should be used. And so putting the blame on everybody else, instead of maybe, that the amount that's being prescribed now is even still a little bit short of what needs to be prescribed in this modern society, where we have to all fit into certain specific expectations that we really weren't made to fit into. I mean, we did not evolve to sit in classrooms, a boring classroom 8 hours a day as kids. That's not how we evolved. So they say, therefore, because stimulants are controlled substances with a high potential for abuse, which can lead to addiction and overdose, there are limits, also known as quotas, set by the DEA for how much of these drugs can be produced. However, for amphetamine medications in 2022, manufacturers did not produce the full amount that these limits permitted them to make. So now they're blaming the companies, saying they didn't use up their whole quota. They say that manufacturers only sold approximately 70% of their allotted quotas for the year. And there were approximately 1 billion more doses that could have been produced, but they did not make or ship. Gee, I wonder why that is. When you put a quota and say, we're not going to let you make any more of this medication, do you think a drug company is going to be interested in pouring more money into and squeezing out the last bit of their quotas in that? Or are they going to try to put their resources towards something where they might actually be able to increase the amount if they need it? Like, for instance, medications for COVID during that time, which they could then produce and produce and produce, and needed people to work on the assembly line, essentially, to crank those medications and vaccines and test kits out. So why would it make any sense to keep on working, producing Ritalin or Adderall when you know that even though the demand is there, the government's not going to let you make any more? You can't make any more money. So why are you going to squeeze out the last few percent when you can put your resources into something that has a chance to really earn you money? And that's a major problem that the DEA and FDA just kind of paper over here. So then after that, they come up with a bunch of bad recommendations, which are just unrealistic. They say the FDA is asking professional groups and healthcare providers to accelerate efforts to support appropriate diagnosis and treatment of ADHD. Well, ADHD has been recognized for more than 50 years, and there's been thousands, maybe millions of studies by now, but certainly thousands of studies on ADHD and what's the appropriate treatment, especially for children, but also in adults. We already know that we don't need special guidelines or committees or anyone else. They go on to say that they're supporting a scientific meeting on ADHD in adults and considerations for diagnosis and treatment. So some committee to meet and to talk about this, like that's going to do any good. Look, we know it works. We know the medications are extremely effective. They're really very low risk. In fact, studies have shown that people who have ADHD are less likely to abuse substances if they're on their stimulant medications. If they're not on their stimulant medications, they tend to be, very impulsive. That's a characteristic of the disorder. And then they're much more likely to actually abuse medications. So this whole idea of protecting people from themselves by not letting them have the medications they need is absurd. And it just causes more problems. And then they go on to name things such as the FDA has permitted marketing of a game-based digital therapeutic. So in other words, video games. Yes, you can replace Ritalin with video games. No, that doesn't work. Sorry. So all of this is really needless. People don't need to suffer from a lack of medication. Your kids don't need to suffer in school and get in trouble and get yelled at because they can't help it because they're ADHD. They should have their medication. And it makes no sense for the government to be restricting this medication. In fact, this reflects a general tendency of the government to try to protect us from ourselves. In some ways, I don't understand either political party. I tend to be a libertarian myself, which means I tend to just go for freedom and a decrease of absolute minimum of government because of exactly these kind of things. The government tries to get involved and inevitably causes more problems than it helps. There are a few instances where government regulation can be helpful, but they're very few. Most of the rest of the time, there's all sorts of unseen consequences and unforeseen consequences. So for instance, in the opioid crisis, well, I testified in front of the Mississippi Medical Board when I was trying to stop all the regulations that were coming down the pike. And the data that I had back then, which was from the CDC and other important recognized sources, said that in 2016, 45,000 people died from opioid overdose in the country. And about 15,000 of those were from prescription opiates. The rest were from things like heroin and other fentanyl and other things that are non-prescription. So any kind of regulations you put on doctors is not going to decrease that kind of drug abuse. In any case, the key take-home information from this really is that out of those 45,000 people, there were only 15,000 that were prescribed those medications, and that was about the same number that died that year from non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs such as aspirin, Motrin, naproxen, all of those kind of drugs. And then if you throw in the Tylenol overdoses and deaths, you probably went beyond that. So in other words, these very effective, largely very safe and very inexpensive painkillers, the opiates, were no worse as far as killing people than over-the-counter aspirin and Tylenol and naproxen. So where was the opioid crisis? If, when you look at it that way, where was the medical opioid crisis? My contention was that there wasn't one. Because in 2016, when 45,000 people died of opioids, only 15,000 from prescribed opioids. During that same time period, about 85,000 people died from alcohol-related causes. And guess what? 450,000 people, 10 times the number who died from all opioids, died that year from tobacco-related causes. So again, where is the big opioid crisis? And more people died from car accidents that year than the number who died from prescription opioids. Again, where is the crisis? And I predicted at that meeting that if we start restricting things like Percocet and Lortabs and hydrocodone, oxycodone, and not letting doctors prescribe them, and not letting drug abusers scam their doctors, so that they get legitimate name brand pharmaceuticals, so that you know what's in them. If you don't let pain patients get the medication they need, people are going to turn to the streets, and then a lot more people are going to die. So it's very counterproductive to put these regulations in place. And guess what? Most recently, it looks like about 100,000 people are going to die this year. So more than double the opioid deaths in 2016. And I believe it's entirely because we put all these restrictions on doctors when doctors weren't causing any problem at all by prescribing this, unlike what you hear in the news and unlike the lawsuits against Purdue Pharmaceuticals and all this kind of stuff. Doctors were not hooking people on opiates. Again, they remain one of the safest medications. There's a certain percentage of the population, a few percent, who will get addicted. They have basic addictive genes. And they'll get addicted, if not to opiates, to alcohol, which is incredibly dangerous. As I said, it killed 85,000 people in 2016. That was about twice as many as the opioids killed, all opioids. Cigarettes, which kill 10 times the people of opioids. They'll get addicted to gambling. They'll get addicted to sex. They'll get addicted to just about anything. So in any case, that's where my beliefs go. And I believe that trying to protect people from themselves only ends up killing more people, which is exactly what's happening right now. And now with stimulants, the government trying to protect us from becoming hooked on Adderall or something has left people with ADHD without options. And kids are failing at school, and adults are going to be fired at their jobs that they had been doing fine before because they can't get the medication because the government is trying to control it all. So that's my thoughts on that, and I will be back to tell you some more stuff later.